The morning of November 1st, 2011, arrived cold and gray over Oak Haven, the kind of gray that pressed down from the sky like a hand that had made up its mind. The parking lot of Precision Prefab LLC was half empty at 5 minutes to 9. The security camera above the main entrance recorded what happened next, though no one would review that footage for months. And by then, reviewing it would feel beside the point. A pickup truck pulled into a space near the far edge of the lot. Old model, dark green, clean, despite its age. The man who got out moved with the deliberate care of someone who had learned long ago that speed rarely improved outcomes. He was 72 years old. He wore work clothes that had been washed and pressed. Not new, but respected the way certain men of his generation treated the things they owned. His boots were the same ones he wore in the shop every morning, but he had polished them the night before until the leather caught light. He carried a single envelope. The paper was thick and cream-colored, the kind you ordered specially from a stationer's catalog, and waited 2 weeks to receive. The address on the front was written by hand in an architectural script letters, vertical and precise. The handwriting of a man who had spent 50 years drawing lines on paper that other men built from. Inside the envelope was one page. One line item printed on a dot matrix machine that had been sitting in the corner of his office since 1991. The receptionist looked up when he came through the glass door. She looked at the envelope, then at his hands, which were dry and callous, the fingers curved slightly inward, even at rest, shaped by decades of grip into a permanent readiness that did not go away when there was nothing to hold. Then, at his face. He set the envelope on her counter with exactly enough force to keep it from sliding. "I need to see Mr. Steele," he said. "He knows who I am." The man was Hank Carver. And that envelope was about to change everything. But to understand why, you need to know about the fence. And to understand the fence, you have to start where the story starts, which is not in a boardroom or a courtroom or a lawyer's office, but in the spring of 1999 on a Tuesday morning, when a hydraulic driver began punching steel posts into the red clay soil of a valley that still remembered what it felt like before the road came through. 1,240 feet of 4-foot chain link went up along the western edge of Lot 7 in the Oak Haven Industrial Park. On one side of that fence, an 80,000 square foot manufacturing facility would rise within the year. On the other side was Hank Carver. He was 61 years old that spring. He stood at the boundary of his property with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the crew work. Not with anger, not with the performative resignation some men use as a substitute for feeling. With the same focused, patient attention he gave to a plank of wood he had not yet decided what to do with. His land was 3.2 acres long and narrow, running east to west. His grandfather had bought it with $800 scraped together from 3 years of dairy work and fence repair, saving through seasons of weather that tested everything a man thought he was made of. The land had been Carver property since before the county road had pavement, before the nearest town had a stoplight. Along the western edge, for as long as anyone who had lived there could remember, there had been a line of wild cherry trees and blackberry canes. The kind of natural boundary that belongs to no one and serves everyone. The fence crew removed all of it in a morning. In its place stood hard industrial wire and steel posts driven into the earth at 8-foot intervals, square and indifferent as accounting. Hank looked at it for a long time. Then he went back into his shop and picked up the plane he had set down when the trucks arrived. The work was not going to do itself, and the fence was not going to move, and those two facts were not in conflict with each other. The shop had been his father's before it was his, and his grandfather's in a different form before that. Low board and batten siding attached to the rear of the main house, smelling of pine resin and linseed oil, and the dry warmth of a space where wood has been worked for so many years that the smell is no longer a smell, but a presence. Along the east wall, coffee tins stood in rows on pine shelves, each one labeled in strips of masking tape with the same vertical script that would appear decades later on a document that would make a corporate lawyer stop speaking mid-sentence. Bent nails, spare screws sorted by thread count, sandpaper cut into thirds for economy. Every piece of hardware that came off a job got sorted. Every scrap of wood longer than his thumb went into the bin for smaller uses. The bin had no bottom, meaning the smaller uses had a way of getting found. His father Thomas had explained this to him before Hank was old enough to be impatient with explanations. Throwing something away is not an action, Thomas had said. It is a failure of imagination. The raw material of useful things was everywhere if you had the eyes for it. Most people's eyes had been trained toward purchase and disposal, the two clean ends of the object cycle, and they had gone blind to the middle, which was where almost everything of value actually lived. Thomas had learned that from his own father, who had built the original house and barn from timber salvaged after the flood of 1913, when a mill upstream collapsed into the water and sent thousands of board feet of Douglas fir and oak downstream through the valley. While neighbors stood in the mud cataloging losses, the old man walked the riverbank for 3 days with a notebook, recording every floating piece by size and species, making marks in a hand that was more function than beauty. He spent months pulling lumber from the water. He spent 2 more years building. The house he raised from that salvage stood without a shifted wall or a sagging beam for 4 decades after. The notebook was the thing, the habit of writing down what you had received, what it was worth, what it might become. Hank had kept notebooks since he was a young man, and his notebooks had a quality that visitors to the shop sometimes noticed they were not journals. They were inventories, the record of a man accounting to himself for the material world he moved through. He had not yet opened the notebook that would matter most. Clint Boone lived on the adjacent property to the north, the two places separated by a low wooden fence and an apple tree that grew on the line between them and was understood by both men to belong to whoever needed the apples at the moment. Clint was 68, a tall man with a face the color and surface of old saddle leather who grew corn and kept laying hens, and had a manner of standing at fences that suggested he considered an afternoon well spent if it contained at least one decent conversation and at least one decent silence. He and Hank were not alike in most ways, but they had lived side by side long enough to understand each other's quiet, which is a form of closeness that has no clean name in English and does not require one. The morning after the fence crew finished, Clint rested his elbows on the apple tree fence and looked toward the lot next door. "You figure they'll be there long?" he asked. Hank was on the back step with a chisel and a whetstone, long enough to get used to. Clint nodded and said nothing more. That was a complete answer, and they both knew it. Precision. Prefab opened its doors in the fall of 1999. The operation was serious by any regional standard. Flatbeds arrived 3 days a week, carrying kiln-dried Douglas fir from Oregon, southern yellow pine. From Georgia, laminated veneer stock from Quebec. Prime material selected to specification, stored in a climate-controlled staging bay. Before being fed into a line of computer-controlled saws and presses that produced engineered trusses, structural beams, and architectural panels for commercial and residential builders across 3 states. The machines ran 2 shifts, 6 days a week. The plant manager's output board was nearly always current, but precision at that scale creates a specific and unavoidable byproduct. When a 24-foot beam was cut to a customer's dimension of 23 feet and 7 inches, the remaining material could not re-enter the production line. The machines required consistent stock lengths. The offcuts varied too widely in size to be resold in bulk. On the accounting ledger, they were process waste. The cost to dispose of them was $1,500 a month, paid quarterly to an industrial hauling company. A yellow steel bin near the loading dock filled every 2 days with lengths of Douglas fir blocks of maple sheets of Baltic birch, plywood pieces of laminated oak, all of it flawless, all of it cut to uselessness by the last job it had done. A truck came every other morning and drove it to the county landfill. Hank watched this through the fence for the better part of a year. He did not complain about the truck noise or the smell of fresh-cut wood that drifted over the wire when the wind was right. He watched the yellow bin fill and empty. He watched what went into it. He watched it without speaking, because there was nothing he needed to say to anyone about what he was seeing. He was thinking. November of 2000. A Wednesday morning cold enough to make breath visible, but dry the sky pale silver, without shadows. Hank put on his canvas work jacket and laced up his boots and walked across the back of his property toward the loading dock. The shift foreman that morning was Earl Dixon, 55 years old, face ruddy and permanent from 3 decades of outdoor work, moving with the practiced economy of a man whose right knee had stopped giving full cooperation on cold, wet days, and who had simply factored that into his stride. Hank walked to the yellow bin and looked at a piece of Douglas fir lying across the rim. 3 feet long, clear-grained. The color of dried leaves in October. He lifted it and looked at the end grain, which told him what the surface only suggested: no knots, no tension wood, no irregularity. He looked at Earl. Earl looked back. Hank raised the piece of fir slightly. "Can I take this for my wood stove?" Earl looked at the piece, looked at the bin full of identical pieces. He signed the disposal manifests weekly and knew exactly what that signature cost the company on the per-load basis. He looked at the old man in the canvas jacket, standing with a piece of Douglas fir in his gloved hands, and he shrugged. "Take what you want, old man. It all goes to the dump. Just stay clear of the forklift." Fewer than 20 words. 2 men of a generation that still understood, a witness conversation between people of good intent to be binding in the ways that actually mattered. The next morning, Earl told the forklift operator to run the off-cut bin to the back corner of the fence line instead of the main container. Shorter trip. The neighbor could pick through it at his leisure. It saved the company a few minutes per shift and a marginal amount of dumpster space. For the next 11 years, 2 or 3 times a week, the forklift would rumble to the back of the lot and tip the bin. Wood fell over the chain-link fence with a sound like a slow collapse, a boom and clatter, and then the settling quiet of timber finding its rest. That sound became as much a part of the rhythm of Hank's days as the morning birds or the evening freight train 4 miles east. That same night, Hank sat at the kitchen table under the hanging lamp and opened a new notebook. Brown leather cover, graph paper inside. He wrote slowly the way he did things that were going to matter. November 2000, first delivery, approximately 180 board feet, mostly Douglas fir. Market price for clear grade fir, $1.40 per board foot. Estimated disposal cost to the plant for this volume approximately $18. He set the pen down and looked at what he had written. He was not building a legal case. He was not already imagining a confrontation with anyone. He was writing numbers down because that was how his grandfather had thought, and his grandfather's habit of accounting for the value of discarded things had produced a house that outlasted most of the houses built with new material that same year. You recorded what you received. You understood what you were tending. You did not mistake free for worthless. He closed the notebook and put it in the desk drawer. From that day forward, he recorded every delivery, every load, every estimated board footage, every species he pulled from the pile by color and grain and smell, every current market price he found in the forestry trade journal he had subscribed to since 1984. When the first notebook was full, he started a second. When the second was full, he started a third. 11 years of deliveries. Not one missed. What he built from those deliveries was not regardless of what it looked like a pile. The technique was called stickering, and he had learned it from his father, who learned it from his. You started with heavy timber, laid flat on the ground level, keeping everything above it away from the soil moisture. On those timbers, you set the first course of boards. Across those boards, at intervals of roughly 2 feet, you placed the stickers' small, uniform blocks cut from scrap. Each one the same thickness position to create a gap of about 1 inch between every layer of wood above. A second course of boards on top. More stickers. Another course. You built upward in this alternating pattern, and what you produced was not a stack, but a structure with air running through every level of it. That 1 inch of air was the whole point. Wood breathes long after the tree is cut. Kiln drying drives off surface moisture, but it does not resolve the internal stresses that live in wood, the way memory lives in people settled, deep capable of expressing themselves unexpectedly under the right conditions. Lumber closed into a solid stack warps. It cups along the face. It twists at the ends. These movements are subtle enough to be invisible in the yard and consequential enough to ruin a finished piece. Years later, when a cabinet door drops a 1/4 inch on its hinge, or a tabletop develops a wave you can feel with your palm in certain light, air moving freely through a stickered stack allows wood to equalize gradually with the climate it will live in. Not the artificial climate of a kiln, but the actual climate of the valley, the humidity of the summers, and the dry cold of the winters, the full range of what the material will experience for the rest of its life. The internal stresses release slowly over months and years into a state of stability that cannot be purchased or manufactured or rushed. Factory-dried lumber was the first half of the process. What Hank was doing was the second half. The half that cost only patience, which was the one thing he had never been short of. He sorted every delivery by species before anything else. Douglas fir, with its reddish-orange cast and clean, resinous smell. Maple cream-colored and dense, fine-grained, cool to the touch, even in summer. Oak-heavy and dark-veined and open-grained. Anything with a large knot or a crack running with the grain went to the firewood row at the north end of the fence line, stacked in a crosshatch pattern 6 feet high. The clear material, the wood without defect, was handled with a different seriousness. He scraped the construction dust from each piece with a cabinet scraper. He measured it. He noted the dimensions in the notebook. Then he placed it into the appropriate stack with its stickers between the layers. From the road, chaos. From inside the fence, a library organized by a librarian who never expected to have visitors. Sawyer Carver first appeared in Hank's yard regularly when he was 11 years old, the summer after his parents separated, and his mother began bringing him to his grandfather's place on weekends and some evenings when her shifts ran long. He was a red-haired boy, freckled, carrying the particular, unsettled energy of a child whose domestic landscape had recently shifted, and who had not yet found the new footing. He moved through the shop quickly and carelessly. He asked questions without waiting for answers. He filled rooms with noise, the way water fills a jar automatically and without judgment. The wood along the fence embarrassed him by the time he was 12. It was enormous by then, visible from the county road, a lumpy silhouette of accumulated material that provoked the imagination of people driving past in ways that were rarely charitable. He had started calling it the junkyard, and the name had the particular sticking power of labels that contained just enough visible truth to feel accurate. One evening, he sat on the top rail of the apple tree fence, watching Hank lay stickers across a new course of maple boards. "What do you actually see when you look at this?" Sawyer asked. Hank placed a sticker, carefully checking its alignment against the one before it. He picked up a board and held it toward the boy. "What kind of wood is this? I don't know." "Wood. Maple. Feel it. Feel." The boy came over. Hank put his hand flat on the surface of the board. The wood was smooth and warm, and had a density that was different from anything Sawyer had handled at the hardware store, a settled quality in the material that he did not have words for, but his hand registered without instruction. "The mill next door paid $3 a board foot for this," Hank said. Then they threw the short pieces in the bin. He looked at the stack. "What do you see?" Sawyer looked. He saw a junkyard. He saw something his grandfather cared about in a way that did not yet make sense in the terms available to him. "I'm not sure," he said. "You will be," Hank said, not as a promise, as a statement about how time worked. The years between 2000 and 2004 moved through the routine of the shop and the deliveries and the gradual growth of the stickered inventory. The mound became a ridge. The ridge became something that from the right angle resembled a geographic feature. Hank estimated in his notebook that by midsummer of 2004 he had received close to 10,000 board feet of usable material. The stacks held lumber that had been air drying for up to 4 years. A commercial supplier would not have had anything comparable in stock at any price. Sawyer was 15 by then, carrying the specific awkwardness of that age like a coat that did not fit in any direction. He cared what things looked like in the way that 15-year-olds care about such things, which is to say, with a consuming intensity that is invisible until it is triggered and then impossible to ignore. He brought a friend from school home once that summer. The boy stopped on the county road and stared at the fence line with a look that required no interpretation. Sawyer kept walking and did not look back. The August night it happened was hot even after dark, the kind of heat that makes the air feel deliberate. 3 boys from town 16 and 17 with nothing particular to do, and the particular carelessness that forms when youth travels in groups climbed the gate at the road end of Hank's property. They found the stacked wood almost immediately. The tallest stack stood over 6 feet, a structure of interlocked courses that had taken Hank most of a week to build. One of the boys put his shoulder into it. The stack held for a moment, then shifted, then came apart in a long lateral cascade, each course of boards sliding off the stickers and striking the one below, a sound like a slow collapse of something hollow and heavy, ending in a scatter of lumber across 12 feet of ground. They knocked over 2 more before Hank's porch light came on. Sawyer came out the back door before Hank reached the steps. The boy stood in the half-dark, looking at the collapsed stacks, 3 rows of carefully built inventory, fanned across the dirt in all directions. He had watched his grandfather build those stacks. He knew how many evenings they had required. He turned toward the house. "Call the sheriff," Sawyer said. His voice had an edge that was equal parts anger and something else, something closer to hurt. Hank came down the steps carrying his coffee mug and walked past him toward the scattered wood. "Hank, count them," Hank said, crouching beside the nearest pile of boards. "Tell me if anything is missing." Sawyer stood where he was. He wanted accountability. He wanted someone to be made to stand in front of what they had done and answer for it. He looked at his grandfather, who had already begun sorting pieces back into order with the same unhurried attention he brought to any work, and something in the boy's chest tightened with a frustration that had no clean outlet. He started counting. Nothing was missing. The wood was all present, all of it, just lying wrong. He reported this without inflection. Hank nodded as if the answer confirmed something he had not doubted. "Then nothing is gone. Pick up that end." They rebuilt in the partial, dark porch light and a fragment of moon between them. Sawyer lifted the heavy ends of the boards, and Hank placed the stickers, and they worked without conversation, because neither of them had arrived at words that would serve the moment. It took close to an hour. When the stacks were back in order, Hank walked the top course, once running his fingertips along the surface to check the level. "Why didn't you go after them?" Sawyer asked. "Because they don't know what they're standing next to," Hank said. He looked at the rebuilt stacks, at the fence line, at his grandson, the people who need to understand what this is. They will understand when the time is right. You don't accomplish that by chasing boys down a road in the dark. Sawyer went inside without an answer. He was not satisfied because he was 15 and satisfaction required visible justice. But in the hour they had spent rebuilding, in the dark something had changed without announcing itself, the way things change in young men, when experience works faster than understanding can follow. In the summer of 2005, Hank drew the plans for a storage building at the kitchen table. The shed where he kept his personal walnut and cherry stock had begun to rot at the sill plates, and the roof admitted water at the northwest corner. The replacement would not be a shed. 12 by 24 feet, gambrel roof to maximize loft storage. Every piece of wood in it coming from the fence line. The engineering was done by hand with a framing square and a calculator. Trusses were cut from Douglas fir that had been stickering for 3 years and assembled on the shop floor with half-lap joints. Walls framed with 2x6 stock. Sheathing pieced from 3/4-inch plywood, because no single offcut was large enough to cover a full bay fitted together like a puzzle with tight seams. Sawyer helped that summer with the grudging availability of a 17-year-old whose social calendar had not been consulted. One afternoon, holding the end of a rafter, while Hank marked a cut, he said what he had been thinking since they started. Why not buy the lumber? It would take half the time. Hank drew his line with a carpenter's pencil. Fast is not the goal. Good is the goal. Sawyer held the rafter and did not respond, which was his established method for disagreeing with the statement that he could not immediately refute. The building went up that summer. From outside, it looked like a working structure in a working yard, which is what it was. Inside, the joints were tight, and the roof plane was true to a level. The loft could hold 2,000 board feet. Hank moved his oldest personal stock in first, then began transferring the most seasoned wood from the stickered stacks along the fence. As material moved indoors, the fence line replenished from the factory's continuing deliveries. The system found its rhythm and held it. 3 years later, Sawyer was 19, finishing his first year studying business administration at the county community college, and he came home with the look of someone who has been given a set of new tools and wants to apply them to every surface available. He sat across from Hank at the kitchen table on his second evening back and brought up the land. "This property has real value in this location," he said. "Right next to the park, you could lease the western strip to the factory for parking or staging. Even 100 a month puts money in your pocket that isn't there now. Hank looked up from the piece of oak he was sanding by hand on the table surface, working with 220 grit in a motion that followed the grain. What am I getting from that strip now? Sawyer paused. Nothing, I guess. So how is 100 better than nothing? Because 100 is 100 you didn't have. Hank set the sandpaper down. He stood and walked toward the back door. Come with me. They went to the small storage shed, and Hank reached inside for a piece of maple that had been stickering since 2003. 6 years. He handed it to the boy. Sawyer held it. It was heavier than he expected. The surface had a settled quality, a density that was different from any lumber he had handled at the building supply when Hank sent him for hardware. He could not have named the difference precisely, but his hands registered it without instruction. This maple has been drying for 6 years, Hank said. You cannot buy this from a supplier because no supplier holds stock for 6 years. The people who want furniture that stays flat through 50 winters, that takes a plane to a mirror, finish that does not tell on itself when the humidity changes, they cannot find this in a catalog. He looked at Sawyer. What is it worth? Sawyer thought about it honestly. More than regular maple, considerably more. Hank put the board back in its position in the stack. And none of that exists yet. It is potential, waiting to become actual. He closed the shed door. If I lease the land to the factory, I take $100 a month and I lose the space where this is being made. Sawyer was quiet. The question you're asking is a price question, Hank said. The answer I'm giving is a value answer. They look identical from the outside, and they are not the same thing at all. Sawyer drove back to the college 3 days later and thought about that distinction for most of the 2-hour trip. Between 2008 and 2011, Hank acquired machines. He bought a table saw with a 5-horsepower motor for $300 at an estate auction in the next county, the cast iron top still flat after 60 years of use. A 24-inch jointer from a high school wood shop, closing its program equipment, worth $15,000. New acquired for $500. A bandsaw, a drill press, a dust collection system. He paid in cash, loaded each machine onto a borrowed trailer, and drove it home with the care a man takes when hauling something that cost him something. He spent evenings restoring them. New bearings, tables flattened and squared, fences trued, motors rewired to code. He worked on them in the larger building he had been framing at the back of the property, 30 feet wide and 50 deep 6x6 posts in every corner. 1x8 siding, a metal roof that was the only material he purchased because no factory scrap would serve at a roof's pitch. Every piece of wood in the structure came from the fence line. He wired it from the main shop panel with a circuit for each tool. The building filled the way. Reservoirs fill incrementally, and then noticeably, until one morning, he stood in the central bay and the stacks on either side ran the full length of both wings. And the machine stood ready in the light from the high windows, and the smell of the place was wood and oil and time and something else, something less identifiable. The specific atmosphere of a space that has been prepared for a long time for a purpose. It is about to begin serving. In the spring of 2011, the conglomerate that had acquired Precision Prefab sent a man to Oak Haven. His name was Brandon Steele. He was 34 years old. He carried a tablet everywhere he went and moved through the factory floor with the contained energy of someone who converted all visible information into variables and found inefficiency in the conversion. He had a way of looking at a space that made the people in it feel like columns in a spreadsheet that had not yet been optimized. On his third day, he watched a forklift turn away from the main container and head toward the back corner of the property line. He followed on foot. He watched the bin tilt and the wood fall over the fence. He stood at the wire and looked at the land on the other side. Back at his desk, he opened the satellite map and zoomed in. He pulled the disposal invoices. $1,500 a month. He saw the accumulation along the fence, the sheds, the structure going up at the back of the lot. His mind, trained to identify liability and opportunity as two sides of the same variable, identified both simultaneously. He closed the laptop. He decided to go talk to the neighbor. He walked across the parking lot in his clean work shirt and his boots that had never seen a day of actual work. And he had the particular confidence of a man who has assessed a situation and believes the assessment is complete. He did not know about the notebook. He did not know that the accumulated wood behind the fence had been sorted, measured, stickered, and cataloged across 11 years of deliberate evenings. He did not know that the large building at the back of the property held machinery, or that those machines were restored and wired and ready, or that the lumber stacked in the wings of that building had been drying long enough to be called something other than lumber by the people who understood the difference. He thought he was walking into a conversation he had already won. That was the first mistake Brandon Steele made in Oak Haven. It would not be the last. Brandon Steele knocked on the workshop doorframe with 2 knuckles. The kind of knock designed to announce presence without revealing any uncertainty about whether the announcement was welcome. The smell of the shop reached him before his eyes adjusted to the interior light. Pine resin and linseed oil, and something older underneath, both the accumulated warmth of a space where wood has been worked for decades until the smell of it is not a smell anymore, but a presence. The way a long-occupied room holds the character of whoever has lived in it longest. Hank Carver did not look up. He was at the bench with the Stanley Bailey plane, 1.5 feet of cast iron, with a rosewood handle shaped by 3 generations of grip. He had the iron on a leather strop working the bevel, in long, slow strokes, checking the edge against his thumb at measured intervals. The motion was unhurried in the way that competence is always unhurried, with no excess movement anywhere. He finished what he was doing. He tightened the cap iron. Then he set the plane down and turned. Steele introduced himself with the economy of a man who does it many times daily. Operations manager. New ownership. He had been reviewing the arrangements regarding the off-cut material and needed to bring things into alignment with the company's operational standards. He made it sound considerate, even generous, as if the alignment were a courtesy he was extending in both directions. The proposal was this: a lease agreement, $100 a month. Precision Prefab would designate the back corner of the adjacent property as a controlled material staging area. They would manage the material and remove it on their schedule, and Hank would do nothing beyond accepting the monthly payment. Steele smiled when he reached the end of it, a calibrated smile practiced, the smile of a man who had made versions of this offer before, in different rooms with different older men, and had always seen it received. "The wood is not debris," Hank said. "It is lumber." The smile did not disappear entirely, but it changed quality, like a key finding the right keyhole, but turned by the wrong hand. Steele regrouped and came at it from a different angle. He used words like waste product, and liability, exposure, and mutual benefit, and he was thorough with each of them, but he was also without knowing it, speaking a language Hank had last used and discarded sometime before Steele was born. "No," Hank said. The words sat in the room between them without moving. Steele was not accustomed to a simple refusal. In his professional experience, no was the beginning of a negotiation, and people who said it quickly were usually the ones who moved fastest when the right structure was offered. He shifted to the other side of the argument. Audit exposure, undocumented process, a parent company with compliance standards that could not accommodate an uninsured, uncontracted arrangement with an adjacent landowner. The cost of formalizing the disposal through commercial means was $1,500 a month, and while that was an operational expense, he would prefer to avoid. It was a clean solution, documentable, and his responsibility was to operate within documented parameters. He said all of this without raising his voice. He was describing reality as his world defined it. That kind of description has its own persuasive power, the power of systems explaining themselves to people who have not chosen to live inside them. And then he added the accumulated material along the fence line represented a potential violation of Local Ordinance 114B, uncontrolled accumulation of solid waste. 30 days from the formal notice to remediate fully. If not addressed, he would have no choice but to notify code enforcement. Hank reached out and picked up the plane from the bench. He turned it in his hands and looked at the iron in the window light, checking the edge the way he had been about to check it before the knock at the door. He ran the pad of his thumb along the bevel with the patience of a man for whom interruptions are simply the space between the parts of the work that matter. "You do what you have to do," he said. Steele waited a moment for something further. Nothing came. He left. The walk back across the parking lot took longer than the walk to the shop, though the distance was the same. He did not slow down. But something in the return trip had a weight the outward trip had not carried, and he felt it without being able to identify its source. Again, the certified letter arrived 9 days later, and was everything a certified letter from corporate legal counsel is designed to be dense, specific, and without warmth. Precision Prefab L, LC, was formally terminating the informal disposal arrangement, effective in 30 days. The accumulated debris on the Hank Carver property constituted a potential violation of Local Ordinance 114B. Full remediation was required by the specified date, or the company would notify the town code enforcement office and pursue all available remedies. The word debris appeared 4 times in 2 pages. The word lumber did not appear at all. Hank read it at the kitchen counter. He folded it along its original creases and set it with the rest of the mail. Then he went out to the shop and opened his notebook and wrote a single annotation on the current page 30 days. He did not call an attorney. He did not speak to anyone about the letter that evening. He worked until dark and went to bed at his usual hour and slept in the uncomplicated way of people who have made their decisions far enough in advance that the arrival of consequences does not require renegotiation. The letter had been seen by more people than Steele intended, the way things in towns of that size always are. And by the following morning, Oak Haven had formed around it the 2 camps that form around every local conflict that has a clear small party and a clear large one. One camp thought Hank Carver was an old man with an accumulation problem who had finally been asked to address it. They used the word finally as though they had been waiting, which in some cases they had been. The other camp thought a corporation had used the language of process to pressure a man who had been doing a sensible thing with material that would otherwise have gone into the ground. They were louder and angrier, which is always true of the camp that has chosen the side of the person. Grady Briggs, the town code enforcement officer, drove past the property twice in the 3 days after the letter became public knowledge. He was a deliberate man, methodical in his movements, and the twice daily drive-by was noted by at least 2 people who knew both him and Hank well enough to understand what it meant that he had not stopped. He looked at the fence line through the truck window and kept moving, twice, without stopping. And Sawyer came home the night the letter went public on the local community page. He had read it on his phone in the parking lot of the college and driven home carrying the tight-shouldered energy of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation during a 2-hour drive. He found his grandfather at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the trade journal the same hour and the same posture as any other evening, which is what Sawyer found maddening about it. He walked Steele through the whole thing, Sawyer said. He kept his voice level with effort. He had $100 a month sitting right there, and he walked away from it, and now there's nothing, and we have 30 days to deal with whatever's out there before someone shows up with a citation book. Hank looked at him across the table. Do you trust me? The question arrived differently than Sawyer had prepared for. He had organized his thinking around strategy and options and the relative wisdom of various positions his grandfather could have taken. The question did not engage any of that. It went underneath it to a layer where argument does not function. Of course I trust you, Sawyer said. But, he stopped. Hank waited. The thing Sawyer could not finish saying was this: that trusting someone was not the same as understanding them, and that understanding what a person was doing required more information than trust by itself could supply. He heard that thought clearly in the moment before he would have spoken it, and he also heard clearly that it was not a reason to disbelieve. It was only a statement about the limit of what he currently knew. He did not finish the sentence. Come to the back building in the morning, Hank said. I need the other side of the jointer fence held steady while I reset the height. He picked up his tea. He looked at the trade journal. The conversation was done in the way that certain conversations end, not because everything has been said, but because what needed to be established has been established and the rest can wait. Sawyer went to bed. He lay with his eyes open for a while. He thought about trust as a kind of knowledge, whether it counted as actually knowing something or only as agreeing to wait for knowledge. He did not resolve it. In the morning, he was at the building with his coffee before Hank arrived, and he held the jointer fence without being asked twice. Ed. Clint Boone came over the apple tree fence the day after that. He sat in the old chair in the corner of the shop, the one that had held Thomas Carver for years of watching his son work, and he looked at Hank moving a piece of oak across the bench plane. The shavings came off in long, even curls that fell to the floor and rested there like something that had been tightly wound for a long time and had finally been given permission to relax. What is the actual plan? Clint asked. Cleaning it up, Hank said without pausing the stroke. Cleaning it up how Hank set the board on its edge and sighted down the face. He looked at Clint across the bench. It was a brief look, not long, but it had the quality of a full sentence compressed into a glance. Clint was quiet for a long moment. He looked out the shop window toward the large building at the back of the property, the one he had watched go up, board by board, over 2 years from his side of the fence, the one whose purpose he had asked about at various points and received answers that told you the general shape without the specific dimensions. He sat with what he knew and what he did not know, and what the look across the bench had communicated, and he put those things together in the manner of a man who has known someone long enough to follow an incomplete map. He nodded once. It was slow and certain. If you need somebody to hold the other end of something, he said on his way out, I'm over there. He did not look back. He did not need to. The call Grady Briggs least wanted to take came on a Thursday afternoon when the code enforcement office was quiet and there was no one else present to give him a reason to delay picking up. Steele was efficient. He had documentation. Satellite imagery, the ordnance text, a property survey. He would forward everything. He understood that Grady had a job to do, and he was simply calling to ensure that the relevant process was set in motion as the relevant ordinances required. He said the word relevant twice. Grady sat at his desk after the call ended and looked at the open violation folder on the right side of his desk. He had known Hank Carver since they were both 17 and sitting in the back of the same classroom. He had driven past that fence line twice in 3 days without stopping. He had reasons for that, professional reasons, legitimate ones, about reviewing ordinance language before conducting any conversation that might be construed as guidance. Those reasons were real. They were also not the only reasons. He picked up his keys. He drove out to the county road and turned toward the industrial park. He pulled up in front of the gate at Hank's property and put the truck in park and looked through the windshield at the fence line, the stacked wood visible from the road, the large building at the back, the small square of light from the shop window. He sat in the truck for 15 minutes. Then he drove back to the office. He told himself he needed to be certain of the ordinance language. That was true. He told himself he needed to avoid any appearance of preferential treatment in either direction. That was also true. He sat at his desk for another hour without opening the violation folder, and he did not entirely account for why. Earl Dixon was at the kitchen table with his coffee and the local paper before 6 a.m, the same way he had been before 6, every morning since retiring, his body still operating on shift start time 2 years after the factory had stopped requiring it to. He read the short article without particular expression. It gave him the facts in the order they had become available to the reporter, which was not the order in which they had happened, which is the way local reporting always works. He set the paper down. He held the coffee mug without drinking from it. He looked out the kitchen window at the maple in the yard, which had not yet started to turn. He set the mug down without having drunk from it. He picked up the phone. Hank, he said when the call connected. Earl Dixon. He went through it plainly without preamble, the quarterly report he had filed. In the second quarter of 2001, the email response from Tom Williams the following day. The company domain in the return address, the specific language Williams had used. Mutually beneficial and approved. He explained that the email had stayed on his personal account when the company upgraded its server archive. I still have it, he said. If there's a meeting. Something where it matters. Hank was quiet on his end for a moment. Earl, you do not have to do that, he said. I know I don't have to. Earl shifted in his chair. The bad knee registered the change in position the way it always did. Tom Williams was a decent man. The arrangement made sense. What that kid they sent in doesn't understand is that some things work because they make sense for everyone involved, not because they're written down somewhere. He paused. You let me know if there's a meeting. The community meeting filled the hall in a way that surprised people who organized community meetings for a living. Grady Briggs sat at the front table with a manila folder he had brought but had not yet opened. Brandon Steele arrived with his company attorney, a man named Pierce, who wore a suit with a crease that had survived the drive from the city and carried himself with the professional neutrality of someone paid to be unreadable. They took the table across from Grady. Steele had a printed summary of the ordinances in his tablet. He looked like a man who had stopped revising his preparation 2 days before the event. He spoke first, and he spoke well. He covered the ordinance language, the liability exposure, the absence of any formal documentation, the company's documented disposal costs against the gap of an uncontracted arrangement. He was not dismissive of Hank Carver personally. He was something more impersonal than dismissive. He treated the situation as an inherited systems failure that he was there to correct, and he addressed the room with the calm conviction of someone who has never had cause to doubt that process properly applied produces the right outcome. When he finished, he looked at Grady Briggs the way a man looks at a traffic light he expects to turn green. The back door of the hall opened. Earl Dixon came in. He wore a flannel shirt with the collar buttoned, his white hair combed. He walked with the deliberate economy of his bad knee, which required acknowledgement but did not require accommodation. He did not wait to be recognized. He went to the front row and stood facing the tables. "My name is Earl Dixon." He said it to the room, not to any individual. Shift foreman at Precision. Prefab for 11 years. I set up the arrangement with Hank Carver in November of 2000. I reported it up the chain in my second quarter operations summary the following spring. Tom Williams replied in writing from his company address. He walked to Grady's table and placed his phone face up in front of him. The screen showed an email. Original sender, Tom Williams, Precision Prefab Company domain. Date, April 2001. The language was specific. The arrangement was consistent with operational efficiency and was approved for continuation. The room absorbed it. Pierce leaned into Steele's space and said something below the threshold of the room to hear. Steele did not alter his expression. "Mr. Dixon," Steele said, with the measured tone of a man managing his response in real time. An informal email between two individuals over a decade ago does not establish a formal contract. The ordinance governs the current physical condition of the property. Our position has not changed. Grady read the email. He read it a second time. He noted the date, the sender, the domain, the specific phrasing. He pushed the phone gently back toward Earl and looked at neither Steele nor Earl when he spoke. "I will review all the relevant documentation," he said. His voice was level. "All factors will be considered before I make any determination." It was not a victory for either side, but in a room full of people who had come hoping to see something definitive. The introduction of Earl Dixon's phone into the proceedings had made the situation considerably less simple than Steele's opening remarks had suggested. The room felt that, and it mattered even without a ruling attached to it. Grady stayed at the hall after the room emptied. He told the deputy to go ahead and locked up himself. He sat at the front table with the folder he had brought and the coffee that had gone cold beside it, and he opened the folder. It was the Industrial Park Zone Compliance file going back to the park's founding. He had pulled it on instinct before the meeting, the instinct of someone who has worked long enough with documents to know that instincts about documents are worth the time they cost. He went through the Precision records backward from the most recent year. Standard compliance, environmental filings, operational audits. Tax credit applications under the county's Environmental Responsibility Reduction Program, which allowed industrial tenants to claim partial credit against their business tax for documented waste disposal costs. He found the gap on the third year he examined. The disposal costs claimed on the credit applications were higher than the costs reflected on the invoices from the contracted hauling company. Not by a large margin and not erratically, by a consistent amount month after month, year after year, enough that when Grady added it up in pencil on the back cover of the folder, he produced a number that was not nothing. He wrote it in pencil because he was not yet certain enough of anything to write in ink. He sat with that number. He closed the folder. He drove home in the dark, and that was not the last thing he looked at that night, because he opened the folder again at his kitchen table and found an additional discrepancy in the insurance filings from 2005, a site plan description that did not align with what had actually been built on the lot. He noted that in pencil, too. He put both pieces of paper in the folder and the folder in his briefcase and went to bed. That was not the only thing Grady Briggs found in that folder, but the rest of it could wait until he understood what he was going to do with what he already had. 2 weeks before the deadline, Donna Weaver was the last person in the precision prefab office. She had listened for Steele's car in the lot, the way you listen for a sound you are not going to act until after you no longer hear. It pulled out at 5:48. She waited until 6, and then opened the company archive system. She was an accountant and had been for 22 years in 3 industries, and the quality she carried through all of them was a physical sensitivity to numerical inconsistency, a response in the body that resembled a kind of low-grade discomfort, like something left on that should be off. The town meeting had introduced a document she had not known existed. The email from Tom Williams confirmed by Earl Dixon with the company domain in the sender address, which meant the original lived in the archive if the archive reached back far enough. She had been told when she started the job that it went back to the founding. She had been told this as a point of institutional pride. She searched. Williams named the date range, the terms adjacent and arrangement and informal. The search returned one document, a memo addressed to Finance and Operations. April 2001, Tom Williams, signature block with title. The language was brief and administrative. The register of a decision already made being passed to the relevant departments for their awareness. The informal agreement with the adjacent property owner has been reviewed and is approved for operational continuation on the basis of mutual benefit. File under ongoing site relations. No separate contract required. Review if ownership of adjacent property changes. She read it twice. Then she printed a copy and folded it in 4 and put it in her personal bag. She shut down the archive. She put on her coat. She turned off her desk lamp and walked down the hall and out of the building. She did not know exactly what she was going to do, but she knew with the same precision that told her when a number was wrong who needed to know the document existed, and it was not Brandon Steele. The 30 days moved differently from inside the fence. Hank hired Nash Briggs for the work, Grady's boy 17, and saving for a car, sturdy and quiet in the way of young men who have grown up around people who don't speak unless they have something to say. Nash could follow an instruction the first time and did not require it to be given again, which was the full list of what the job demanded. They used a wheelbarrow and their hands. No chipper, no roll-off, no commercial equipment that would signal to anyone watching from the factory windows that the wood was being destroyed. They began at the back of the fence line, where the stacks had been standing longest, and they dismantled each one course by course, lifting the boards flat onto the wheelbarrow, carrying them through the building's side door, and placing them into their designated positions inside. Hank directed with words of 2 or 3 syllables. Nash learned the system in half a morning and asked no questions after that. Inside the building, the wings on either side of the main bay were fitted with horizontal supports, and the stacks went up in the same order they had stood outside species by species, date by date. The machines in the central bay had been positioned and leveled and wired and tested. The main bay was open in the way that a well-built working space is open the proportions right, the light from the high south windows falling in long, clean rectangles across the concrete floor that shifted with the morning and warmed toward afternoon. Sawyer came on the weekends. He arrived early and stayed late, and somewhere in the 3rd weekend, the question he had been carrying since the night he came home with tight shoulders began to change its form. Not to disappear. To become something more specific. Something that could be held and examined rather than argued with. He watched his grandfather's hands without intending to. The placement of each board. The attention given to a piece of Douglas fir that had been drying since 2002, handled not as material to be moved, but as material that had been prepared and was now being honored by the use it was finally going to be put to. Sawyer had grown up watching those hands his entire life and he was only now beginning to understand that watching was not the same as seeing. They worked mostly without conversation. Nash left by midday. After that, it was the two of them and the sound of the wheelbarrow on the concrete and the occasional call of something. In the field to the south and the steady diminishment of the fence line as it gave its inventory up to the interior. On the last full day of work, Sawyer drove out to the property late in the afternoon to drop off a tool he had borrowed that morning. He came down the county road from the college end, the direction he had driven 100 times, and he made the turn past the industrial park fence and slowed for the gate. He braked harder than he intended. The fence line was empty, not cleared in a rough or hurried way, not stripped down to bare dirt in the manner of something removed against its will. Empty the way a field is empty after harvest. A settled bareness, the impression of what had stood there, still legible in the compressed ground, and the sticker marks and the faint lines where the bases of the stacks had rested for years. The wild cherry stumps that predated the chain link were visible under the late light for the first time since he could remember. Sawyer sat in the car with the engine idling and looked at the fence line for a long time. 11 years of accumulation, gone. And not a sound from any commercial equipment. No truck noise, no chipper, nothing his grandfather had said would indicate where it had gone or how. He looked at the building at the back of the property. The doors were closed. The sign on the front wall was new. He could see that even from the road, a piece of laminated wood 3 feet wide, with letters cut into the face, visible but not yet readable at this distance. He pulled through the gate and drove up to the building and got out. The sign read Carver & Son, Custom Millwork. The letters were cut in an architectural font, deep and clean, no paint. Just the wood itself, the natural variation of the Douglas fir grain, giving each letter a texture that could not have been produced by any other material. He stood in front of it for a moment. His name was not on it. But Son was him, had always been him, and the sign had been made before he had agreed to anything, which meant his grandfather had agreed for him years before the question was ever asked out loud. He found the side door unlocked and went in. Talk. Brandon Steele stood at the window of the second-floor conference room the morning of October 31st with a cup of coffee he had poured from the machine in the hall. He looked out over the rear of the property at the fence line. He set the cup on the windowsill. The ground on the other side was empty, clean in the way that deadlines, when they produce the intended result, are satisfying. The accumulation that had been there when he arrived, the mounded and irregular silhouette of 11 years, was gone. The fence line ran straight and uninterrupted from one post to the other, with nothing behind it but flat ground and the structures at the back of the property that had always been there. He sat down at the conference table and found the calendar entry he had made 6 weeks earlier and changed its status to resolved. It was a small transaction, 2 clicks, the kind of conclusion that does not require ceremony. He did not wonder where the wood had gone. He had issued a deadline, and the deadline had been met. He had no reason to look further than that, what he could not see from the window, because the distance was too great, and the building at the back had no windows. On the north face was what the building now contained. He had never had cause to go inside it. He had categorized it on his first assessment as a storage structure for accumulated material, and had not revisited that categorization. He did not know about the machines restored and wired and ready. He did not know about the stacks in the wings. 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 board feet of material, sorted by species and age, the oldest of it having been in preparation for more than a decade. He did not know about the sign on the front face of the building or what it said. He knew the ground was clear, and the 30-day notice had been honored, and the process had produced the outcome his management report would require. At the kitchen table of the house at the other end of the same fence line, Hank Carver sat with a pen and a piece of cream-colored paper and wrote the way he had written in every notebook for 40 years. Vertical letters, deliberate, and even no hurry, no doubt about what came next. He wrote the recipient's name and address at the top. He wrote the date. He wrote a single line item. He wrote the number that 11 notebooks of careful accounting, adjusted conservatively and divided honestly, had produced. $47,281.50. He folded the page in thirds. He sealed it in the cream envelope. He set it on the counter next to his keys. In the morning, he would carry it across the parking lot and place it on a reception desk and say he needed to see the man who thought the wood was gone. And what would happen after that had been prepared for a very long time. The drive from the Carver property to the Precision Prefab parking lot took 4 minutes on a morning with no traffic, which was most mornings in Oak Haven in November. Hank had driven it before to return borrowed tools to drop off a survey document when the property line needed confirming ordinary trips that left no particular trace. This one he drove at the same speed as all the others. The cream envelope was on the passenger seat. The heater ran on low. The sky was the color of old pewter flat, and even without wind. He pulled into the lot at 8:55. He parked in a space near the edge, not close to the door, the way a man with business to complete might park, but where a man will parks who expects to be there long enough that the precise distance to the entrance does not matter. He sat for a moment after turning off the engine, not gathering himself because there was nothing to gather. He had been ready for this particular morning for longer than the man inside the building had been alive. He picked up the envelope and got out. Donna Weaver was at her desk when the door opened. She recognized him the moment he came through the glass, not from the newspaper photograph, which had not been a good likeness, but from the quality of how he moved, which was the same quality she had read about without being able to name it, and had then recognized when she started paying attention. He moved as though each step had been considered before it was taken, not cautiously, but with the economy of a man who did not waste motion any more than he wasted material. She stood before he reached the counter. She kept her voice low, the same register she used when the numbers in a report needed to be communicated to someone who needed to understand them before anyone else in the room did. She told him about the memo, the archive, the sender, the date, the specific language Williams had used. She told him she had a printed copy, and that if a meeting required a witness to its existence, she would be there. Hank looked at her for a moment. The look was not surprised. It was the look of a man who has understood for a long time that the world contains more allies than it reveals in advance, and who has been correct about that without needing to depend on it. He nodded once. The acknowledgement was complete and required no elaboration. She turned and called Steele's extension. Steele came out of the back corridor with the contained energy of a man in motion between tasks, the tablet under one arm, dressed in the same register of clean professional that he had worn every day since arriving. Nothing excessive, nothing casual, the costume of someone who wanted to be taken seriously and had learned that presentation was part of the argument. He saw Hank. He saw the envelope. His expression shifted through something brief and unreadable and arrived at composed. He reached out and took the envelope when Hank offered it. He opened it at the counter with the efficient gesture of a man who reads his mail standing up because sitting down would imply the mail required more time than he intends to give it. He unfolded the single page. He read the line item. He read the total. Then he laughed. It was not a social laugh. It was the involuntary kind, the kind that comes out when something strikes the mind as so far outside the expected parameters that the body responds before the mind catches up. It was short and sharp and genuine, and the instant it left him, he could not take it back. He looked at Hank. Is this a joke? It is not a joke. The laughter was already gone. Steele looked at the page again. His mind, which processed everything as variables in a system, was running the numbers without being asked to. 1,500 a month. 18,000 a year. 11 years. $198,000 in disposal costs. The invoice before him claimed less than a quarter of that figure. This is not an enforceable document, Steele said. There was no contract, no agreed fee structure, no basis for a claim of this nature. There was an agreement, Hank said. I used the wood as agreed. The invoice reflects the value of what I provided in return. Storage, sorting, management of material that would otherwise have cost your company 3 times this amount to dispose of. Steele set the page on the counter. You are welcome to pursue this through whatever legal channel you believe supports it. Hank did not look at the page. He looked at Steele. I would like you to come and see how the material was used. Then you can decide what channel makes sense. Steele should have declined. The professional version of himself would have told him that facility tours initiated by the opposing party in a potential dispute were not best practice. But the professional version of himself had been trained to gather information before making determinations, and there was something in the quality of the request that registered, without giving itself a name as information he did not yet have. He said nothing for a moment. Then he set the tablet on the counter and came around from behind it. Sawyer Carver was waiting outside by the truck. He had not said he would be there, and Hank had not told him to come, and he was there anyway, the way he had been appearing at the right place without instruction for several weeks now. He was wearing a canvas jacket, not entirely unlike his grandfather's, though he had not noticed this himself. He held a bound document under one arm, the kind of thing produced by a student who had learned to make his thinking visible in print. He fell into step without being invited. They crossed the parking lot in a line. The old man in front, his grandson beside him, the operations manager behind. No one spoke. The sky was still flat and gray, and the temperature had dropped another 2 degrees since 8 in the morning. The kind of subtle cold that accumulates without announcing itself until you realize you have been in it for an hour. They went through the side gate in the chain-link fence, the one that opened onto the Carver property with a key. Hank produced from his jacket pocket. They walked the length of the property. The strip of ground along the fence where the stacks had stood for 11 years was bare now, the compressed soil still showing the shapes of what had stood on it. Sticker marks and base timber impressions in the clay. The negative space of an inventory that had moved indoors. Steele looked at the bare ground as he passed. He had seen it from the window, and it had told him the problem was resolved. He had not considered that resolved and removed were not the same word. They passed the old workshop. They passed the house. They came to the large building at the back of the property. Steele read the sign. He read it the way you read something that does not match the category you had assigned to the thing you are looking at. Carver and Son, custom millwork. The letters were incised in Douglas fir, the natural grain of the wood, giving each character a variation that no manufactured sign could reproduce. He looked at it long enough that Hank had already produced the key to the side door and opened it, before Steele looked down from the sign. Hank pushed the larger sliding door along its track, and the building opened. The light came from high south-facing windows, installed along the upper quarter of the south wall, and it fell in long, clean panels across the concrete floor of the main bay. In that light stood the machines. The table saw, with its 5-horsepower motor, and its cast iron top that 50 years of use had not removed the flatness from. The jointer 24 inches wide, the one from the school woodshop that had closed its program that Sawyer had held the fence on while Hank reset the height. The band saw, the drill press, the dust collection system with its pipes running neat and deliberate along the ceiling, joists above. Each machine positioned in relation to the others with the logic of a room that was built to be used in a specific sequence, which it was. And on both sides of the central bay, filling the wings from floor to the height a man could comfortably reach, were the stacks. Douglas fir in warm red-orange tones. Maple the color of heavy cream. Oak dark and dense, with the open grain that takes a finish like no other species. Baltic birch on the lower shelves, void-free, each sheet pristine. Board feet that Hank had estimated in the most recent notebook entry at something close to 23,000. Each stack faced by a small wooden tag, written in the same hand as every notebook entry, noting species dimension and the year the material had arrived at the fence. Steele stood in the center of the bay and did not speak. Pierce, the company attorney, had followed at a distance from the parking lot out of the particular professional instinct that keeps lawyers close to situations that are moving faster than expected. He stepped in behind Sawyer and stopped. He looked left and looked right and did not say anything either. The smell of the building was specific and layered. Pine resin and oak tannin, and the clean mineral note of the concrete floor, and beneath all of it, something that was not exactly a smell, but a quality. The aggregate character of a space where time itself had been stored, alongside the wood patient and without expiration. Hank walked to the shelf at the near end of the Douglas fir section and took down a board. He did not offer it to Steele. He held it in both hands with the same attention he gave every piece of material he had ever held. The left hand supporting the weight, the right hand running slowly along the face, feeling for the flatness and the surface that 11 years of air drying had produced. Then he set it back. "This is what the material became," he said. Sawyer stepped forward. He set the bound document on the flat extension of the table saw, which served as the closest horizontal surface of the right height. The document was a student inventory and valuation analysis, the kind of project assigned in a second-year business administration course to teach students how to apply market pricing to physical assets. The case study he had told his professor was based on a relative's business. He had not been more specific than that. "The current market valuation of this inventory," he said to the room, "not to Steele specifically, is approximately $94,000 for the raw material at going commercial rates. Discounted 50% for non-standard dimensions, you land at $47,000. He looked at Steele. "The invoice is not a demand for money that was owed. It is a statement of equivalence. The wood that was going to cost your company nearly $200,000 over 11 years to dispose of is sitting in this building at a value equal to what my grandfather is asking for services rendered." Pierce had his notepad out. He was writing and not looking up, the habit of a man who processes information more accurately when his eyes are elsewhere. Steele looked at the stacks. He looked at the invoice in his hand, which he had carried from the reception counter, without realizing he had kept it. He looked at the sign on the exterior of the building, visible through the open door. He looked at Hank Carver, who was looking at nothing in particular, in the way of a man who has said what needed to be said, and is now simply waiting for the world to arrange itself around it. Outside, a single crow landed on the fence post nearest the building and sat there without moving for a moment, then lifted off into the gray sky without sound. They walked back to the conference room, all of them. The conference table at Precision Prefab was composite board with a laminate surface, made to suggest wood without being wood, the kind of surface that wipes clean without leaving evidence of what happened on it. 12 chairs. 3 people came through the door on Precision's side. Steele Pierce, and on the speakerphone at the center of the table, a voice from the corporate office 2 states away. That had been briefed by Steele the night before and had opinions it was not yet ready to make specific. Hank sat on the other side. Sawyer sat next to him. At the foot of the table in the chair that no one had indicated was for him, and from which no one asked him to move, Grady Briggs sat down and placed his folder on the table surface and folded his hands on top of it. Steele looked at Grady. "This is a private business discussion." Grady met his gaze. "I'm the code enforcement officer for this municipality," he said. "I have outstanding questions related to the Precision prefab site that are relevant to any arrangement made regarding the adjacent property." His voice was even. He was not there as Hank's friend. He was there as the person who had an open folder and specific questions, and both of those things were real, regardless of which of Hank's friends he also happened to be. Pierce looked at Steele. Steele looked at the folder. He did not ask Grady to leave. Pierce began. He was thorough and careful in the way that attorneys who bill by the hour are trained to be taking the long road around every point to ensure no ground was ceded by implication. The informal arrangement had no legal standing. The invoice had no contractual basis. The company was prepared to acknowledge the historical relationship between the 2 properties and offer as a gesture of good faith, and in full settlement of any claimed interest, the sum of $3,000. Hank's hands rested on the table. He said nothing. Sawyer opened the document to a specific page and slid it across the table toward Pierce. The numbers were on that page. He did not explain them. He let them sit there the way numbers always sit when they have been arrived at honestly and are not being disputed. $3,000, Sawyer said, is not good faith. It is an opening position that assumes we don't know what we're looking at. We have reviewed the inventory valuation, Pierce said, and while we note its content, a student project prepared by an interested party does not constitute an independent appraisal. You can have it independently appraised, Sawyer said. I would welcome that. Pierce wrote something on his notepad. The voice on the speakerphone had been silent since the room filled. Grady opened his folder. He placed 2 documents on the table in front of Pierce. He did not explain them immediately. He let Pierce read, which Pierce did, with the expression of a man reading something he was hoping would turn out to be less than it appeared to be. It turned out to be precisely what it appeared to be. These are from the municipal site. Compliance record, Grady said. The first is the actual disposal invoice from the contracted hauling company for calendar year 2009. The second is the waste disposal cost figure, entered on Precision Prefab's environmental responsibility credit application for the same year, which was submitted to the county. The county is the basis for a partial tax credit. Pierce set the pages down. He looked at Steele. The discrepancy. Grady continued with the patience of a man who had sat across tables from people who needed things repeated, has been consistent across multiple years. I have not yet submitted a formal inquiry to the relevant county office. That inquiry would be a routine matter once initiated, but it has not been initiated yet. The room absorbed this. The voice from the speakerphone said Kevin. Pierce turned slightly toward the phone. A moment, he said. He leaned across and muted the speaker and spoke to Steele in a register that was below the threshold of what the room could follow, but the exchange was brief, which told the room something about what was being discussed, regardless of the words. Steele unmuted the phone. Then the door opened. Donna Weaver came in. She was wearing the same practical expression she wore when she arrived at the office every morning, the face of a woman who had done what she came to do before the meeting started and was here to complete the record. She set a single page on the table between Pierce and Steele. "I apologize for the interruption," she said, without sounding as though she required the apology to be accepted. "This is from the company's internal archive." A memo from Director Williams dated April of 2001 addressed to finance and operations regarding the disposal arrangement with the adjacent property. The metadata is intact and verifiable. I thought it was relevant to the discussion. She looked at no one in particular and left. Pierce picked up the document. His expression did not change, but his hand moved slightly, a small, involuntary adjustment of grip, the kind of thing that happens when a man who expected to hold a strong hand discovers the hand is somewhat less strong than he believed. Steele looked at the paper. He had reviewed the company archive himself briefly in the first week after arriving, looking for documentation of existing arrangements. He had searched by Hank Carver's name by the word disposal by the address of the property. He had not found this document. He had not searched for the phrase site relations. He looked across the table at Hank Carver, who had the same expression he had worn since coming through the conference room door, which was no particular expression at all. The face of a man who is neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, because he is not tracking the emotional temperature of the room, only its direction. "Hank Steele said." His voice had lost the operational register it had carried in every previous exchange. It was not quite flat, not quite human, somewhere in the transition between them. "How long have you been planning this?" Hank considered the question. 11 years was not the right answer, because it implied calculation from the beginning, which was not accurate. He had not planned 11 years ago to sit in this room today. He had simply done what the work required at every step, and the work done properly had produced this. "I planned to use the wood well," he said. The rest followed from that. Pierce leaned back in his chair, a small motion that contained a large recalibration. He looked at the two documents on the table, the inventory valuation and the memo, and he looked at the folder Grady had not yet closed, and he looked at the ceiling briefly, the way lawyers look when they are counting costs they did not anticipate. Hank. Everyone looked at Hank because Hank had said his own name, which was not a thing people did, and then they understood he was not saying his name, but addressing someone by it. He was looking at Sawyer, the boy, the young man, his grandson who had held the other end of boards in the dark and sat at kitchen tables not understanding, and held the jointer fence steady, while Hank reset the height and stood in the parking lot this morning with a jacket not entirely unlike the one Hank was wearing, having arrived without being asked, having always arrived without being asked, which was its own kind of answer to its own kind of question. "Show him the last page," Hank said. Sawyer opened the document to the final page. He turned it so it faced across the table. It was not the valuation. It was a projection, the kind of financial projection that a second-year business student produces when the assignment asks them to think, not about what something is worth today, but about what it will produce over time. It showed what a consistent supply of premium raw material at a 10% cost of market price would mean for a small custom millwork operation over a decade. The numbers were conservative. They were also not small. Steele looked at the projection for a long time. The voice from the phone said, "Brandon, what are we looking at?" "What we are looking at," Pierce said with the careful precision of a man constructing a sentence that will not need to be revisited, "is a situation in which the traditional settlement approach presents significant exposure, and the more efficient resolution may involve a structured ongoing arrangement." Hank spoke without looking at the phone. "I will withdraw the invoice," he said. all 47,000. I will withdraw it in full." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when what has been said has not yet been processed. If Precision Prefab will sign a 10-year supply agreement, all production offcuts delivered to Carver and Son, custom millwork. Price of 10 cents on every dollar of original material cost. Delivered by forklift to the rear property boundary. Documented, contracted, auditable to whatever standard Jan requires. He paused once, not for effect, but because the next sentence was the one that mattered most and he wanted the room to be fully present for it. "That is what I want," he said. "That is what I have always wanted." The invoice is not a demand. It is a way of making clear that the alternative exists. Pierce wrote for several seconds without stopping. The sound of the pen on the paper was the only sound in the room. The voice from the phone said quietly, as though speaking to itself, 10 cents on the dollar. "It converts a disposal liability to a documented transaction," Pierce said without looking up. "The environmental credit applications can be corrected going forward. The ongoing audit question becomes a compliance correction rather than a violation finding provided the municipality is satisfied." Everyone looked at Grady Briggs. Grady looked at his folder. He looked at Hank. He looked at the table. A compliance correction documented promptly and verified, he said would satisfy the outstanding inquiry. He closed the folder. His hands remained on top of it. The phone was silent for a count of 5. Then the voice said Kevin draft the agreement. The settlement took 3 weeks to finalize. Precision Prefab paid Hank Carver $15,000 negotiated, down from the invoice figure and characterized in the documents as a good faith acknowledgement of the prior operational relationship. Pierce was careful about the language, and Hank did not argue it. The 10-year supply agreement was signed the same afternoon as the settlement. The forklift arrangement was documented in an appendix with a diagram and a delivery schedule. Steele initialed every page with the signature of a man completing a process, rather than concluding a defeat, which was accurate enough. Grady Briggs submitted his compliance inquiry to the relevant county office and noted within it that Precision Prefab had proactively initiated a corrections process prior to the formal inquiry being received. The response from the county came back in 30 days and was administrative in its nature, rather than punitive, which was the best available outcome and the one Grady had made available by timing. Donna Weaver continued at her desk on the second floor. Steele did not reference what she had done. She did not require him to. The numbers in her reports were correct and would remain correct going forward, and that was the only outcome she had entered the conference room to secure. Steele left Oak Haven 14 months after he arrived, promoted to a regional oversight position at the parent company where his skills were genuinely well suited to what the role required. He had made the precision operation more efficient in several measurable ways. He had also signed a 10-year contract that his successor would need to manage, and would come to regard after consulting the numbers as one of the more straightforward arrangements in the portfolio. Ray Holden became the site manager and communicated with Sawyer about delivery schedules by email on Tuesday mornings with the minimal language of people who have understood each other from the first exchange. Earl Dixon came to the building in the summer of 2013. He drove himself the bad knee accommodated by a longer pause before getting out of the car, and he walked without assistance to the large sliding door and stood in the entrance, the way a man stands in a doorway when he is deciding whether the interior matches what he has carried in his memory of it. Sawyer showed him the stacks in the wings. Earl moved along one of the Douglas fir rows and ran a hand along the face of a board without taking it from the stack, the gesture of someone who worked with the material long enough to read it by feel. He stopped at one of the tags and looked at the year written on it. "This from the early days?" he asked. 2001, Sawyer said. One of the first loads after the arrangement was confirmed. Earl looked at the board for a moment. He was thinking of a Tuesday morning in 2001 when he had read a reply from Tom Williams on his work computer and forwarded the thread to his personal account as a matter of habit. The same habit that had produced a filing cabinet in his home office containing 20 years of employment records that his wife had occasionally asked him about, and that he had always said he would sort through eventually. He had sorted through them when he needed to. The habit had been correct. Good wood, he said. He said it about the Douglas fir, and he may have meant something else, and he may have meant only what he said. He went home before noon and called Hank that evening, and they talked for 20 minutes about things unrelated to wood, or invoices, or corporate operations, and that was the better part of the call. Clint Boone continued to lean on the apple tree fence. The conversations between the two properties continued in the register they had always occupied, which was largely silence, with occasional language inserted to mark its quality. Clint's corn came in light one August, due to dry weather, and Hank brought over 2 jars of preserved tomatoes from the garden without being asked. Clint left a bag of apples on the shop doorstep without knocking. These were the transactions that sustained something older and less nameable than friendship. Sawyer did not go back to college. He told his mother first, because she had paid part of the tuition and deserved to hear it directly. He told her not that he was dropping out, but that he was changing courses, which was accurate, and that the new course had a better teacher, which was also accurate. She came to the property the following Sunday and stood inside the building for a long time without saying much. She ran her hand along a piece of maple the way Earl had done with the Douglas fir, not knowing she was repeating the gesture which was the gesture people made in that building when they were arriving at something they could not say. She hugged her son. She drove home. She did not argue. Hank began Sawyer's education the morning after the negotiation, which was the morning after the night Sawyer had sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea. He did not finish understanding for the first time the shape of what had been built around him and inside him over years he had spent not entirely paying attention. The education did not have a name or a curriculum. It had a sequence. The sequence was determined by what the work required next and Hank's judgment about which part of the work Sawyer was ready for. He learned to identify wood by smell before he confirmed it by sight. He learned to read the end grain of a board for the story of the tree. It came from the age rings in the direction of growth and what those things predicted about how the material would move in service over decades. He learned the difference between a sharp tool and a sharp enough tool, which was not a small difference. He learned that the first cut on a new piece of stock was always made to establish a true surface from which everything else would be referenced, because you cannot build an accurate thing from an inaccurate beginning. He learned to be patient with wood the way his grandfather was patient with it, which meant not patient in a passive or resigned way, but in the active and engaged way of someone who understands that certain processes cannot be accelerated without destroying what the process is meant to produce. The planning of a face to a mirror finish could not be rushed. The fitting of a mortise to its tenon was not finished until it was finished. The distinction between close and correct was not negotiable. He made mistakes. The first drawer he fitted was too tight when in summer, and would be worse in winter, and had to be remade. The first set of mortise joints he cut required Hank to look at them for a long moment before saying simply again. He remade them, and they were better, and Hank looked at those for a moment too, and said the third set will be right. The third set was right. He learned to sand in the direction of the grain, which he had known abstractly since childhood, and to actually do it, which required his hands to know something his mind had known for 20 years. He learned to apply finish in thin coats and wait for each one to cure, and how to tell by touch when the surface was ready for the next. He learned that a finish applied correctly made the wood visible, rather than covering it, which was a distinction he understood through his hands before his words caught up. Nash Briggs came on 2 mornings a week to start, and then 3, and then by the following year full-time. He had a quality of attention that was uncommon in someone his age, a steadiness in the presence of a task that did not require external confirmation to sustain itself. He learned differently from Sawyer, more quietly, less verbally, by watching for longer before asking. But he arrived at the same places. Hank treated him with the same exacting patience he applied to everything he taught, which was not gentleness, exily, but a kind of respect for the difficulty of learning and acknowledgement that the gap between knowing and being able was real and required time to cross, and that time spent crossing it was not wasted. The business grew the way things grown from good roots grow, not quickly, but without interruption. Word went from one client to another through the channel that has always moved the best work, which is the experience of the finished piece in the room where it lives. A kitchen table that did not shift across seasons, a set of cabinet doors that hung true for 20 years, a set of built-in shelves in a house in the next county that the architect specified by name after seeing a similar installation 3 towns over. The client list crossed into neighboring states. The work did not come fast, but it came reliably, and reliability was what the operation was built for. Hank worked for 8 more years. He sewed without stopping, the way rivers slow in late summer, the same volume of water, moving at a different speed through familiar ground. His hands did not lose their knowledge because the knowledge in them was not stored in the part of a man that ages. He could feel a flaw in a board surface that Sawyer could not yet see, and he could hear a machine running slightly out of true that Nash had not yet learned to distinguish from the normal voice of the equipment. He stepped back from the heavier work by instinct, not instruction in the way that experienced craftsmen know without being told what the work still requires of them and what it no longer does. He died in the winter of 2019, quietly in his sleep at 80 years old. He did not have the end that dramatic stories tend to assign to people who have lived the way he lived, the deathbed wisdom or the final accounting. He went to sleep and did not wake up, which is the most ordinary ending imaginable, and the one that for a man who had spent his life making the ordinary into something of lasting use was entirely in keeping with the work. Grady Briggs came to the service. Clint Boone stood in the 3rd row and did not speak to anyone, and shook Sawyer's hand at the end for a long time without saying anything, which was the right thing. Earl Dixon drove himself and sat near the back, and left without speaking, either which was also the right thing. Nash Briggs sat with the family in the seat beside Sawyer's mother, which was where he had come to belong. Hank left the house and the land and the business to Sawyer. There was no ambiguity about this in the documents, and no one expected there to be. Carver and Son continued without interruption. In the small office off the main bay, the one converted from the old tool storage room that had held hardware and coffee tins and strips of sandpaper for 50 years, Sawyer put a desk and a chair and a laptop and a window that looked out over the central bay where the machines ran and the light came through the high south windows in those long, clean panels that moved across the floor as the day turned. He had worked at this desk for several years before he decided what to put on the wall beside the window, and when he decided, he knew exactly what it was. 3 things. The first was the original invoice, $47,281.50. One line item, printed on a dot matrix machine that still worked because the man who owned it had taken care of it. The cream paper had not yellowed because it had been kept where it was meant to be kept. The handwriting at the top, the The name and address and date was vertical and precise. The architectural hand of a man who drew what he meant and meant what he drew. The second was the first page of the first notebook. November 2000. First delivery. Approximately 180 board feet, mostly Douglas fir. Market price, $1.40. The handwriting was the same hand 40 years younger, steadier perhaps before the decades had added their own texture. The page had the quality of a document that was not intended as a document when it was written, only as a record, which is the quality that distinguishes the records that last from the ones that do not. The third was a photograph. Black and white, the contrast slightly high from being shot in low light. It showed the fence line at the back of the property taken from the interior side, looking outward. In the frame, visible from behind, was a man in a canvas jacket with leather gloves placing a sticker across a course of boards in the half-dark of a late afternoon in autumn. The face was not visible, only the posture and the hands and the particular quality of attention in the set of the shoulders, the way a man looks when he is doing exactly what he is meant to be doing, and the question of whether anyone is watching has not occurred to him. Sawyer had found the photograph in the back of a drawer in the house while clearing his grandfather's things. He did not know who had taken it or when. He did not know if Hank had known it existed. He framed it and hung it without finding out, because finding out was not the point. The point was what was in the image. Not a man building a pile. Not an old eccentric, accumulating what other people considered waste. A man in the middle of a project that had not yet revealed its full dimensions to anyone watching from the outside, including the people closest to him, including, at times, himself. A man doing the patient work of converting what was discarded into what would last. A man at the precise midpoint between nothing and everything in the interval that most people cannot tolerate long enough to reach the other side of. Sawyer sometimes stood in front of those three things before starting the day. Not every day. On the days when the work was difficult in a way that had nothing to do with the wood, when a decision had to be made that he was not yet sure he was equipped to make, when someone asked him something about the business that he would have needed Hank to answer, and Hank was not there to answer it. He would stand there, and he would look at the three things, and usually by the time he had looked long enough, the answer was somewhere in the looking. Not because the objects contained answers, because the habit of returning to them was itself a form of knowledge, an act of placing yourself in relation to the long work and the long patience and the long trust that the material, if tended carefully, would eventually become what it was always going to be. The factory next door still ran 2 shifts. The forklift still came to the rear boundary on its schedule. The wood still came over the line and into the building. It came through a proper channel now at a contracted price with documentation and signatures and a file number in the county's commercial records. But it came as it had always come because one system's waste was another man's vocabulary, and the sentence Hank Carver had been writing with it for 11 years was still being written by the people he had left behind to continue it. What a company calls waste is only a resource seen without patience. That patience, compounded across years and passed between hands, became the thing that neither the invoice nor the contract could fully describe a working life, a business, a way of understanding what material means when you are willing to wait for it to tell you. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be rushed. It can only be inherited by people willing to stand at a fence line in the dark and begin.